Fire on the Mountain, Part 14. "Not really," said Grissom. "Well, I am, I guess." "I've been thinking about your situation," Grissom said. "It's hard enough to lose somebody, but when they're famous like that, you lose them, but they're not gone. They're everybody else's. They've been expropriated, nationalized." Yasmin laughed grimly. "I never thought of it like that. Isn't that sort of a weird way to look at a relationship?" "I bet it's different for Harriet, though," Grissom went on. "I bet it doesn't hurt her as much as it does you. It would probably do you good to talk about it yourself." "I know," Yasmin said. "Actually, she and I had a little talk last night." Unlike Harper's Ferry, silently commotioned by the shadows of airships sliding overhead, Martinsburg wasn't on the way to anywhere. The only things sliding over were clouds. It was a flat, bustling little city north of the Potomac, where the valley widened out so that the mountains weren't visible on either side. Yasmin found it ugly. Socialism, to the Americans, apparently meant that the new buildings should be all the same size, shape, and color, like soldiers in uniform, and in Martinsburg many of the buildings were new. In Nova Africa, that phase had lasted only a few years, but now even those turn-of-the-century buildings seemed charming in their naive sameness. "Maybe I'm just homesick," Yasmin thought. She was flooded with a sudden desire, almost frightening in its intensity, to see her little wood-frame ochre house on the canal in Charleston. They stopped to top off the battery, and Grissom phoned the old lady's house. Yasmin noticed that people down here talked a little more like Grissom and little less like her mother-in-law. The African soft accent of the border was noticeably beginning to give way to the harsh northern twang. But Laura May Hunter still lived on the border. The first thing Yasmin saw when the uninformed day nurse let her and Grissom into the little house was a tinted picture of Abraham Lincoln on the wall. Lincoln was a Whig, backed by the U.S. Capitol, who had organized a fifth column of Southern whites to support an invasion of Nova Africa in 1870, right after the Independence War. If the whites couldn't keep the slaves, they at least wanted the land back. Though the invaders had been routed at the Battle of Shout's Bend without crossing the Cumberland River, one nation indivisible had become a rallying cry for white nationalists on both sides of the border. The next 5 years, 1870 to 75, were as close to a civil war as Nova Africa was to see. When it began, the new nation south of the Tennessee River was 42% white. When it ended, it was 81% black. In the U.S., veterans and descendants of the Exodus formed the racist backbone of the rightist movements for years. In the Bible Wars of the 1920s, the Homestead Rebellion, even the Second Revolutionary War of '48. In Nova Africa, the whites who embraced or made their own peace with socialism were called comebacks, even if they had never left, and Lincoln was no hero to them. But before his body had even been cut down in 1871, they had become a legend among the border whites in Kentucky, Virginia, and parts of Missouri. Apparently, he still was. Yasmin pointed the picture out to Grissom, who nodded, then shrugged. "The lost cause," he whispered. Following Grissom, who was following the nurse, Yasmin entered a dark parlor and sat in one of the 3 floral print chairs while the nurse went out with a wheelchair, one of the 3 parked in a row in the corner. "She doesn't have the same politics as her ancestor," Grissom whispered. To say the least, Yasmin thought, beginning to wonder what was the purpose of this visit. The room was like a shrine to white supremacy. The painting showed Andrew Jackson strutting under a 26-star flag across a field of dying creek in Cherokee. On an end table, several books sat upright between harp bookends: the Holy Bible, Palgrave's Golden Treasury, Walker's Sea to the Shining Sea, Emerson's Lament for a Last America, Gone with the Wind, and one title that caught Yasmin's eye, John Brown's Body. She pulled it out far enough to see a lurid picture of a hanged man on the cover, then shoved it back just as the nurse wheeled her patient into the room. Above the lumpy sofa, another Lincoln, this one a hollow, stared down with the big, mournful, calculating hound eyes. With the burning of the Charlestown courthouse, the waiting was over, or so it seemed. Everybody seemed relieved, especially the white folks. The war was on. Another plantation house was torched the week after Green Gables, and this one burned to the ground. The slaves not so foolishly putting it out, but Cricket speculated, acting this out, blowing on it. Another 2 days after that. As the Shenandoah was not serious plantation country, this pretty much exhausted the opportunities. The slave market that was burned at Sandy Hook wasn't really a market, but a holding pen for beaters heading up the Potomac from Washington and south along the Valley Road to the cotton and hemp country of the South and West, where slavery was big business. Meanwhile, the town was filling up with volunteers, adventurers, contractors, and newspapermen waiting to see what the government was going to do and how they could turn a dollar off of it. All of them were white, all were men, all were armed, and all of them were full of strong talk. Around the kitchen and the stable, I heard their rumors, their boasts, their threats, and even, reading between the lines, their fears. None of these men was eager to go up to the mountain after Brown. Not after Iron Bridge. They were all waiting on Holiday, the head of the Virginia militia, to arrive from the Tidewater. The private talk, for a stable and tavern boy heard lots of private talk, of Holiday's agents who were already in town arranging provender, was that these over-the-mountain fur-hat hillbillies didn't really know how to deal with niggers as white folks felt free to call us in those days. The fur-hat hillbillies let them talk, though the militia, press, government, and army alike stayed at the Planters or the Potomac. Those who weren't on found tended to eat lunch, at least at Mama's. It was cheaper and better. Every day the big parlor was filled with a wild mix of white men, and the backyard under the catalpa tree with colored. Mama gave all the same fare, cornbread and beans, greens, and ham hocks too fat for eating. A ham hock in those days, great-grandson, would flavor a week's beans. They weren't your skinny wartime hams. Chicken, pork, squirrel, and dove in season, rabbit and catfish, all the game and fish brought from her extensive network of slave and free black entrepreneurs. Mama had her partialities, though, and she would often give me a plate of pigeon breasts or sweet little squirrel hearts to set down near a certain favorite, always a preacher and always colored. We didn't get white preachers whatsoever. I doubt Mama would consider them real preachers anyhow. Mama was in her element, serving rough men strong food and making money. For though she was a slave, she managed all of the old Germans' money. She liked a crowd as much as Deal shunned society. Her warmth in this crowd was in contrast to her brooding silence in private. I found her, my own mother, proud, cold, shy, and mysterious. She seemed to come alive around others, but alone she was remote and distant. I regretted being an only child almost as much as I regretted slavery, though I knew the two were linked. Mama had told me that the reason she'd been sold to Deal was because she could bear no children after me. I think now, looking back, that the lonely life of semi-freedom in town, in a white man's house, killed something in her by taking her away from her people. But she had wanted it. She had managed both our lives and was a slave in name only. Those were strange days, great-grandson. Two countries were fighting a war by night, but eating out of the same pot of greens by day. In fact, the whites seemed positively friendly that August, thinking, I'm sure, that the niggers who weren't up the mountain liked both slavery and them. This particular one of their illusions didn't survive the winter. The black folks, especially those in the town, seemed more mistrustful of one another than of the white folks in those first months of the war. Maybe it was the affair of Granny Lisbeth that did it. All the talk under the catalpa out back was of mules and weather and food, as if there were no such thing as the fire on the mountain, no army of abolitionists burning plantations and setting slaves free. I used to study those dark faces and wonder, did they really believe nothing had changed? Or was it part of the centuries-old mime the African played for the whites and ultimately for ourselves as well? We kids were going through our own changes. Since the raid, and especially since the night I lost Caesar and found the flag, as I think of it, Cricket was more brotherly and less ornery than usual. He didn't pick on me and boss me around like before. Meanwhile, the few friends I had among the white kids in town, such as Sean Coyne, were gone. I didn't see them anymore, not after Iron Bridge, not after the courthouse for sure. End of part 14.